Hello everyone, and I want to bring up a pretty old sort of argument that Christians make in defense of the belief of God. And I've heard it pretty much all my life. And it's the idea that it is impossible to disprove the existence of God. So therefore atheism is stupid, etc., etc., etc. Now, this argument, I hate to say it, I kind of grew up going through a long process in my life of coming to the realization that it's very much wrong. But for me, I really believed it, for a long time, and used it as kind of a defense mechanism for any criticism of what I believe. I said, well, you can't really disprove what I believe, so therefore I'm allowed to believe what I believe. And as a teenager, I grew into the idea of sort of a postmodernist view of thought that no one can prove anything, so therefore it's okay for me to believe my thing, which is taking things a whole other step. But it is also wrong. But that's not the subject of this video. The argument, says that you would have to know everything to disprove the existence of God. You would have to have all knowledge to disprove the existence of God. And if you had all knowledge, then you would be God. Now, the problem with that argument is that it leaves out the possibility of God being a self-contradictory entity, a self-contradictory idea. So, in other words, the argument itself says if you could disprove God, then you would know everything, and therefore you would be God. So it actually works on a contradiction, because you're saying there's no God except I'm God, to know that there's no God. So that's a contradiction. So in other words, the strongest arguments against the existence of God are arguments against the idea of God, that God is a self-contradictory idea. So let's just give you an example. Let's say that I told you that God is, a married bachelor. All right? Well, then you would immediately say, well, that idea doesn't make any sense and it doesn't exist. That such a being doesn't exist, because the idea of that being makes no sense. And such arguments like that, you say, well, those don't apply to the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity. Actually, they have been very much applied to the God of Christianity. If you're not thinking about it, the first obvious option is, how is God one being and also three? Isn't that a contradiction? Isn't that a meaningless concept? So that's an important thing to bring to bear down. What does the Trinity really mean? I won't go into the Trinity too much on this video, other than to say it's not a contradiction, although if you take it one in one sense and three in the exact same sense, then yeah, that is a contradiction. And so it has to be one in one sense and three in a different sense for it not to be a contradiction. Let's say that you believe that, okay, my God is called Thor, and Thor gives me a candy bar on my, on the day after my birthday every year or something like that, and it just shows up under my pillow. Well, then we would go look, and if the candy bar didn't show up under your pillow, then therefore Thor doesn't exist, because you define Thor in such a way that he's testable like that. If the candy bar, you find it every time, that doesn't necessarily mean that Thor exists. That just means that you can't disprove the existence of Thor. Now, let's say we don't find the candy bar, and people come to you and say, well, your God's fake. You've made him up. Obviously, because he didn't do what is part in his definition to always give you the candy bar the day after your birthday. Here's the thing. You could redefine your God in such a way so that it's more and more difficult to test him. Now, the thing is, this is actually, you think this candy bar thing is silly, but this is actually exactly where the number one argument for the existence of God, or against the existence of God, for the non-existence of God, comes to the problem of evil. How can there be evil and suffering in a world where there exists an all-powerful God who loves us? So if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and loves us, then why doesn't he prevent bad things from happening? So, for example, if you were, able to stop a baby from dying, you would certainly do it. So God is able to stop every baby from dying. babies die, therefore this God doesn't exist, because we've defined the properties of this God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving. Now, what Epicurus is the first guy to come up with this, and what he said was the problem of evil. Is he said, if you want to take out all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving, then, an all-powerful God who knows everything but doesn't really love you, is he really God? As Epicurus said, why call it God? Why call him God? If he doesn't have those three attributes, if he's not all-powerful, then he's just kind of a Superman who couldn't quite save you. If he's not all-knowing or something. So, in other words, if he's not able to prevent evil, then why call him God? If he doesn't want to prevent evil, then why call him God? If he's neither able nor willing to prevent evil, then why call him God? Now here's the thing. The higher your concept of God is, the more difficult it is to make this pronouncement. And so, yes, it is theoretically possible to disprove the existence of God with a contradiction. But the interesting thing about it is that as you try to do that, you actually learn more about the concept of God. So there's sort of a theological study of God benefit. So, well, what is God really? What is the highest possible being that we can the greatest thing that we can imagine, the thing of ultimate greatness, the thing of maximum greatness in every possible way that one can be great. Okay, that's really what we mean by God, because if we can imagine a greater being, a greater thing, then even if God existed but he wasn't that great, then he would wish he was that great, and then that idea would be his God, right? So here's the thing. If he's so great, then he would have a plan that is difficult for us to understand. And so that's kind of where the problem of evil falls apart, and it's right there laid out in the book of Job. All these bad things happen to Job, and his friends come in with a simple explanation, karma. These bad things happen to you because you did bad things. And Job's like, I didn't do anything. Okay? And then God comes in, and instead of explaining why the bad things happen to Job, he just says, let's just list out all the things you don't understand. And by the end of it, Job's like, okay, I guess there's a lot I don't understand, God. I trust you. And that's kind of the idea, is that God, you couldn't understand God's plan for why he allowed things to happen to you, even if he explained it to you. Because that's how simple and lacking in our understanding is. So it's this idea of a maximally great being. In philosophical terms, that's what we say. God is a maximally great being. Now the interesting thing is, this becomes one of the more difficult to understand but more rock solid proofs for God's existence. Okay? Because what we can do is we can say, well, a maximally great being would he exist? Would this thing exist in just one possible world or every possible world? Okay? So when I say possible world, I say, just mental possibilities, ideas, different possible worlds. Like the world could be like this, and it could be like this, and there could be this world could exist, and that world could exist. The world. Now, not the planet Earth, not the universe, but just the world reality. Different possible realities may be a better way of putting it. Okay? Well, what would be the greater being? The one that exists in some of those possible worlds? Or an idea of a being that exists in all of them? That there's no reality where he doesn't exist? This is the ontological argument for the existence of God. Because, in other words, what it says is, the greatest conceivable being would actually exist in every possible world. And so, here's the thing. If he exists in some possible worlds, he has to exist in every possible world. Okay? And if he exists in every possible world, he has to exist in the real world. And this argument, people huh? They don't like it, because what you're saying is, if the idea of God is logically possible and not a logical contradiction, then that means that God has to exist. He has to. And this one, people think you can't just say that because the idea of something is possible that therefore it exists. But God's in a different category from average everyday things. because we're talking about a thing of maximal greatness in every possible great making property. That's not your ballpoint pen. That's not a bowl of Frosted Flakes, okay? So, here's the thing. You could, and the argument against it says, well, you can imagine a maximally great pizza, and this maximally great pizza exists in one possible world, and it has to exist in all possible worlds, so therefore it exists in the real world, in our world. Problem is a maximally great pizza, well, we would say, well, if it's maximally great, then it's perfectly loving pizza, right? And it's an all-powerful pizza, and it knows everything, and is just really just God. You just call it a pizza. Good for you, So, and it's a being with freedom and power and control. Come on. So, like, the thing is, the way maybe to wrap your mind around this is the ontological argument for the existence of God. 1 + 1 = 2. Think about that. Is that true for one possible world? Yes, it has to be true for one possible world. In fact, the nature of the entity, the nature of the idea, means that there is no possible reality where 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And that's the idea with the ontological argument for the existence of God. That there is no possible reality where a maximally great thing doesn't exist. Because if there were, then we can imagine an even greater being, and that there's greater that exists in all of them. So the argument, that most people think this is the worst argument for the existence of God ever, but I challenge you to give it thought. And I know atheists out there won't. They might, though. I give them credit. But this isn't that complicated. It's just like so strange. But the thing is, it only applies to the existence of God. The argument against it says, well, God is an undefinable idea, and we can't fully understand what the word God even means, so we can't make these statements about the idea of God. Because actually, in philosophical terms, the idea, that the ontological argument is actually the logic of it, where it says that a maximally great being would have to exist in all possible worlds, including the real world. That's not actually debated. That's not the debate on this argument. Lies in the question: are we able to define God? Because if we are, then He has to exist in all possible worlds. And so that's the argument from the other side, from the atheist side, and philosophical circles says, well, we can't even understand, God. God is too far beyond our comprehension. And so therefore we can't have a definition for the word God, and so therefore we can't say anything we can't make pronouncements. In other words, like, you keep talking about God. What does that even mean? Okay. Now, this is a classical argument that people make. This is the ontological argument against the existence of a thing. And people do it all the time. I had a friend who had a terrible romantic relationship and went really bad. And he got really in a bad mood afterwards and just said that romance doesn't exist. And if anyone tried to tell him that it did, he would argue with them about what they exactly meant by romantic love or relationship or those words. And the problem is if you start trying to define those terms, he can always point out that you can't fully understand what it is, because there's always going to be some piece of the definition that doesn't make sense. And in reality, here's the thing. You can say that about God. We can't fully define God. We can't fully define anything. Here we go. I got a coat hanger. What is the coat hanger made of? Quantum particles that we don't know what they really are. We don't really know what an electron is, what a proton is. We don't know. We can't fully define anything. And here's the point I want to make, is that just because you can't know everything about a thing doesn't mean that you don't know anything about a thing. So whenever you're trying to define something, you have to focus on what in philosophy we call its properties. And so God, we can know that He has some properties. And obviously some of those properties are maximal greatness, right? And so if He's maximally great, then He would exist in every possible world. Because if He didn't, then we could imagine a being that did exist in every possible world, right? And that would be a greater being, right? So therefore, maximal greatness means existing in every possible world. So therefore, he exists in the real world. And so this argument makes God a necessary being. It is impossible for God not to exist. It is as impossible as 1 plus 1 making 4. Now, here's the thing. This is biblical. This is the idea of God that's in the Bible. That God, the reality of God is more certain than the reality of you and me. That God exists independently, that no one created God, that God just cannot fail to exist. It just is in the nature of what he is, that he must exist. His existence is independent, permanent. Okay, so it's just intrinsic in the very definition of what he is, and just whereas you and I, I could fail to exist. It's not hard to conceive of that at all. I don't have maximal greatness. You don't have maximal greatness. We don't have maximal greatness. If we did, we would be God. So the maximal greatness concept is useful. You can compare different concepts of God in other religions, and it's useful, it's handy. So like the Muslim God doesn't forgive you for as many sins as the Christian God does. So who's the greater God? Right? Who's the being you should really worship? Even if the Muslim God existed, I would still worship the Christian God because it's a greater concept and a more lofty goal and a loftier thing to believe in. You see? So this is fun because we debunk, an argument, while at the same time it allows us to do some really fun theology and thinking about the existence of God. And this is something that bugs me about the church, especially in America today where I live, is that most of the intellectual stimulation that people get is outside of church, because church is a place where people just come to feel good. And that's great, feeling good and being supported. I mean, that's good. That should be happening. But the problem is that no one's mind is challenged at church. And there are young people, especially out there, who long to come to church to think. And they're getting all of their intellectual stimulation outside of the church. And that's sad. So, hope you enjoy this video. Think about God.